The show this year is called The Romantics, and in my purview, I kind of look at the show as a modern look back at the Romantic era of art and literature, and in more like globally what that movement meant for the world and for our progression through history, I guess. The beginning of the Romantic era is kind of the departure from the age of logic and reason, and the beginning of the era of feeling and emotion and individuality. So the show is broken apart into eight ideas, I guess. It's really 5 movements if you're looking at things from like a logistical standpoint like I do, but really within some of those movements there's 1 or 2 main ideas. So the show this year starts out with the concept of idealism. And in my world, I look at things a little bit differently. I'm not really attached to the visual production of the show. I'm more thinking about what it sounds like and what it feels like from a musical perspective, and all the production elements that go into just both what we do on the audio side, but also the way we bring some of those elements to life on the front ensemble side. So the beginning of the show starts with idealism, which, I almost think of it like the beginning of like a gothic horror story, where, the ensemble comes out with their capes on. There's something very dark and brooding about the very beginning of the show. And there's really kind of a quiet intensity to the way the show starts, but that kind of explodes off the page as soon as things start moving and we get into the bass drum idea, and then the snares and the mellophones start with like a really like eye-opening opening statement that takes us into the first like full ensemble moment of the show. So I feel like there's a certain like darkness to the show this year that I really, that really resonates with me and that I appreciate. And then as we go through the first production of the show, it kind of transitions from that concept of idealism to the concept of individuality. And the individuality is like the second half of our first production. And for me, I love the concept of individuality in drum corps idiom because, my pleasure and my honor here at the Blue Devils is to work with the front ensemble and to be able to create things for them. And unlike the rest of the corps, like the brass section, the battery percussion, and even the color guard, there's a sort of an ensemble presence about those performers, and they're out on the field. There's less of like that individual connection. But with the front ensemble, I feel like I'm writing a solo performance for each musician. And so when we get into that part of the show, I kind of lean into that identity a little bit as well to promote individuals. There's a lot of, especially right when we get into the beginning of the individuality, it's like it starts with a couple brass features before it kind of gets going in an ensemble standpoint. And if you look around what the front ensemble is doing from an orchestration standpoint, every single person has a different idea, has a different identity, and how they kind of fit into that. So, I think the concept of individuality like lends itself well to the front ensemble because these are the performers who are kind of the face of the ensemble. We're right there in front. They get to have a little bit more of that expressive individual connection with the audience that maybe the rest of the corps doesn't get, being out on the field or being staged sometimes far back with props involved. So, it's like the front ensemble is, a great opportunity for us to have that sense of individuality and expression. And so when we get into that part of the show, like look around for all the different colors and all the varieties, from like people dropping chains on bass drums to like all the different hand drums and like individual percussion accessories that are happening across the front ensemble. And that part of the show is a lot of fun for me to write because I feel like I'm writing like a 14-part chamber percussion ensemble within this massive production that's happening around us. So, that part of the show I feel like really lends itself well to the front ensemble, and there's a lot of really unique elements that we were able to incorporate in that section. The second part of the show this year is entitled Imagination. And musically, it's based on a few different things. There's the main source idea of inspiration for that is a piece of music called Merry-Go-Round of Life by a composer named Joe Hisaishi. He's a Japanese composer. And that section of the show starts out with the front ensemble as well. And one of the things that's really unique and was really fun to create about that production is the way the second movement starts is very free and very loose and very rubato. And those are terms that are not normal for the drum corps idiom, I guess. One of the things that's really striking about that is the manipulation of time. The front ensemble starts with like a really slow tempo. It really develops gradually and peacefully, but then it kind of explodes from like 90 beats per minute to 190 beats per minute and all the way back down again. And I guess one of the strengths of a front ensemble performer these days is that they have that ability to communicate and perform and feed off of one another, where even though the front ensemble is spread from 40-yard line to 40-yard line, which is like a 60-foot spread across the ensemble, the way they communicate visually, the way they emote, the way they feel that, allows us to do these massive sweeping push and pull things with tempo, which is really out of the ordinary for the drum corps idiom. I feel like what we do sometimes is so regimented and it's so strict in terms of tempo and staying like locked in for long periods of time. So I feel like that part of the show is a huge departure from the first production, and that we get to have this like sense of freedom and like looseness to the tempo of the ensemble before the rest of the group comes in and kind of we start getting back into like business as usual. One of the other things that's really fun about that second production of the show is we kind of transition from like this loose, rubato, open, free statement at the beginning of it, and then really immediately it goes into this really gritty, dark, heavy thing with like a light mood around it with the piccolo trumpet soloist. So when we get into that part of the show, we kind of call that the monster. And it's like my like thought process when I was creating this is it was like, it's like an idea that feels very like open and positive and free, and then it's kind of interrupted by these like Frankenstein footsteps where like the whole front ensemble is just like pounding these hits with like the trombone section, and it's real dark and gritty. It's like bomb, bomb, and there's a lot of variety there. We're doing things with like like seed pods and like percussion and metallics, and it's like has this like dark heaviness to it, but also has like a light mood around it. So it's like a really interesting dichotomy of ideas where it's like there's like we still have a little bit of that like gothic horror element to like from the beginning of the show that kind of pervades through this, but then there's like a lightness that soars above the top of it. So it's like a really interesting dichotomy of like dark versus light, and I think it's a real fun part of the show to put together for those reasons. So the third production of our show this year has two distinctively different identities. The beginning of the third production starts with this real this massive cascading brass flourish, where it's like the entire brass line is parked like basically from the 50-yard line across to side 2. And then they have these overlapping 16th note runs that kind of take us from the energy at the end of part 2 right into something new and unique. And with the beginning of our third production, the idea there is introspection. And I think of that section of the show as being like sort of heroic. And one of the trademarks, I guess, of the Romantic era is like the focus on the individual, but also like the ideal of like the individual hero. And I think that part of the show lends itself well. The music is really fun. It's something I never thought we'd do here at the Blue Devils. We're doing some things that are inspired by like Pokemon video games, and there's a lot of things that kind of take me back to my upbringing and my history, so it's been a lot of fun to put that part of the show together. Like when we're going over music source ideas in the fall and kind of putting the show together, there's things that come on the table where I was like, I would never even think to suggest this for this drum corps, because everyone would think I'm trying to push something that I like into this rather than something that's right for the group. But that part of the show is so much fun to get put together, because it's like kind of taking some pieces of music that's like light and it's got this heroic, like noble energy to it. And then from there, there's like a really big shift in gears as we move into like the percussion feature in the second half of that production. And the percussion feature in the second half of our third production this year is based on some video game music, actually. It comes from a Sega Genesis video game called Streets of Rage, which I actually grew up playing that game when I was about 10 years old. And it's like one of those things where like I remember being a kid and I remember playing this video game and I was like, this music is kind of hip, this is kind of cool, and this is kind of different, and something, again, I never thought would translate to the drum corps field, but it's been a lot of fun to put this together. And from a front ensemble and from a production standpoint, this is a part of the show that really leans heavily into what we do and what I do specifically, because there's so many of those elements. It's like a driving percussion feature, there's a lot of interplay between the battery and the front ensemble, but there's also these like electronic elements that kind of put it in a time and place. And we're not looking at it like through the lens of like, this is done in the Romantic era. This is not like the later works of Beethoven by any means. This is kind of like looking back on some of those ideals and some of those concepts through a more modern lens. So, it's like doing the Streets of Rage music and doing like the video game, like the Japanese influenced video game music is like really fun. And it's like one of those opportunities for us to do something that is like really far out and removed from the drum corps idiom, but bring it back and to do it in a style that's really uniquely Blue Devils. I feel like the writing in the battery is like one of the most ambitious things I've ever seen in my 15 years with the organization, so they're definitely taking some massive risks there. The things that the front ensemble is being asked to do from like a time standpoint and the feel and the way the feel shifts from like this 16th note, quarter note based idea to like a dotted 8th note, like fast paced idea, and the way sometimes those feels overlap and do it. It's one of those things where for the audience, you may not detect how deceptively difficult it is to do some of those like 16th note triplet based ideas over this slower feel. But it gives it kind of this frenetic energy, and as the ideas kind of pass back and forth between the battery and the front ensemble, there's like a lot of fun interplay, and there's a lot of like virtuosity that's showcased across the ensemble. So, that part of the show is like a lot of fun to put together because it's, it's ambitious and it's kind of bold, and it's always one of those things that like I feel like with this organization, we could take some of those risks and we could go out there because the integrity of all the people involved in a project like this is so high that everyone has like a unique contribution to what they bring to the table musically and visually. And we could do these things that feel really far outside of the drum corps idiom, but we find ways to bring it back and make it really conventional and have aspects of it that feel really like connected with like the history of this organization and the way we kind of take some of those risks. So it's definitely like one of the harder shells to crack for me in putting together the show, but I also feel like it allows some opportunities for some really cool things and some things that are really different from what I've seen in the drum corps idiom. Part 4 of the show this year is based on a piece of music by an artist named Billy Porter. The song is called Time. And I think that is a piece of music that, even though like from a genre style, it's very far removed from some of the ideas in the rest of the show. It's a little bit more modern. It's a little bit more of like a traditional Blue Devils jazz ballad, I think reminiscent of some of the things we've done in recent history. But I think one of the things that's really interesting is the way that idea relates back to the concept of the show. The idea of romanticism is very timeless. And I feel like this part of the show kind of talks about like, the history and looking back at things through time, through a different lens. And I feel like that's like one of the real strong points of this show is taking this concept of romanticism and all of the beauty and like the embrace of art and like the individual, and then kind of looking at it through like a modern lens and doing something that feels like a smoky jazz ballad that's like very, sultry and like very on brand with like the way we approach some of these pieces of music with the Blue Devils. So, it allows for a lot of freedom and expression from the front ensemble and a lot of interplay between like the soloists and the front ensemble that allows for some really cool musical moments. So I always feel like the ballad is a chance for me to flex a little bit with the front ensemble and what those performers are capable of, and I feel like this one is no exception. There's some really beautiful moments and some really nice open ideas in there, and then there's also these little bursts of virtuosity from the mallet section, from the rhythm section, from our drum set player this year, where they're able to kind of show their capabilities and kind of show what they do and have a little bit of freedom to do that. Whereas, other parts of the show, the front ensemble has more of a supportive role, and we fit into the context of the greater good. And then I feel like we get into these ballad moments, and it's like kind of a chance for the front ensemble to stretch their legs and like kind of like trace a different shape across an entire piece of music. So, yeah. So the ballad this year is a lot of fun, and I feel like there's an emotional payoff to it that's really powerful and unique and special. Part 5 in the show this year is 2 major concepts in the show. It starts with the concept of immersion. And immersion is like, I look at that through my lens as just the embrace of fully engaging yourself into something. The 5th production this year starts with a percussion moment for us, again, comes out of the ballad. We have this really soft ending with the flugelhorn soloist coming out of the ballad. And then right away, there's like a lot of identity. The bass drums start with something very virtuosic. And then on top of that, the front ensemble has these like kind of cascading and overlapping lines where we're like modulating from like an 8th note to a 5-lit to a triplet to a 16th note. And then finally, what happens there is as the bass drums conclude their moment, we kind of start to clear the palette and clear some space a little bit. And then there's like a little bit of a focus on individuals within the battery. So they start with like these duets and these little pods. And right in that point of the show musically, the front ensemble opens up a little bit. Things get a little bit more spacious rhythmically from all the density of the beginning section. And then there's like spotlights on these little virtuosic bursts of energy from the battery percussion performers. And it's kind of fun. It's like a chance for us to show like what the performers in this battery section can do this year. And I feel like, every year they push the envelope in different ways. But I think sometimes the one of the things that gets lost in creating a drum corps show is just how talented these individuals are. And so I feel like the beginning of this production is a great spotlight to show like the chops that these drummers have, the creativity of like both the musicians who engage in the process with our design staff, but also the design staff of Dave Glide and Scott Johnson, and their like massive percussion repertoire and vocabulary. And I feel feel like that part of the show is a chance for, where those guys especially do some really fresh things that are unique and outside of the beaten path for what we've done at the Blue Devils traditionally. So, it's like, I've worked with Dave Glide and Scott Johnson for many years, but I feel like one of the things that is unique about Scott and Dave and their writing styles specifically is that I always feel like there's an idea or an experiment or a concept that they start working on in the fall. And sometimes those concepts never go past like the camp stage. We'll experiment with a few things at the camps. But Scott comes up with these like ideas and these concepts, and then sometimes they find their way into the show. And I feel like the culmination of that moment is like one of those moments where Scott has an idea and he runs with it, and then Dave and I kind of create the soundscape and the environment around it to make it really special and unique. So that section of the show is really powerful and engaging, but also what's happening from like a percussion vocabulary standpoint and the rhythmic manipulations of all the rhythmic modulations, it's really cool. And the source material for that idea is based on two things. There's the Oppenheimer source material, Do You Hear the Music, which is like a fantastic piece of music that has like been capturing my imagination since I first heard it this year. And then on top of that, we kind of start to hint and allude to this melody, which is the culmination of the show, which is the melody from the Poor Things soundtrack. And there's little bits and pieces of it sprinkled throughout the show, but once we get into this fifth production, that's where it's definitely the direction we're going in. So I always look at the beginning of this fifth production and immersion as something where we kind of bring you into both those worlds. We have like a little bit of a juxtaposition of two musical ideas, and then that evolves and opens up and allows for some true virtuosity. Getting out of that idea, finally the last section of our show is called Incomprehensible. And I look at this part of the show as one of those sections where it's just the power of the imagination being unlocked. It's some really powerful ideas where we start with kind of some of the ideas and some of the chord structure and some of the musical motifs from the Oppenheimer source material. And then finally it lands on this like arrival with the Poor Things material. It's just such a powerful emotional payoff at the end of the show. And I think one of the things about the Romantic era that is unique and distinctive is just the embrace of emotion. And I think in a lot of like classical literature and like where art movements were happening at that time, it was very structured, it was very logical, it was very reasonable. And then I feel like when you get into the Romantic era, there's almost this like exploration of the way you feel and the way things make you feel. And creating this musical mood at the end of the show just feels like it's such a gratifying release, and it's such a gratifying and pleasing arrival, and it just opens up and it's just glorious, and it feels like the heavens kind of speaking to you from above. So it's a really powerful part of the show, and I think that, actually the term incomprehensible is like a suitable adjective to describe that section of the show, because it's just the power of the human imagination kind of being unlocked. So it's been a lot of fun to put that part of the production together, and I think that the audience is really going to enjoy it when they get let in on that secret too. I think that one of the great things about a drum corps show is it's like looking at a painting. People are going to take away different things from it. I don't think we're too prescriptive in telling you what you should be feeling or what you should be thinking along the way. I think there's a lot of darkness in the show this year, but there's also like a human element that I think is really inviting and really all-encompassing, where it's like, we look at some things that are a little bit more grotesque, they're a little darker, they're a little more brutal, but then there's these moments of humanity in there that are really inviting and really emotional. And I feel like, one of the hallmarks of like the Romantic era is just the embrace of human emotion. It's like not being afraid to say who you are and how you feel. And I think, in the world of art, that was really different at that time, in that era, in the 1800s, when the Romantic era was kind of starting and taking place. But I think even now, I think there's a modern connection to it that's really significant, where we focus so much on the things we have to do, our obligations, our daily life, the things we have to push through just to survive and exist and thrive here. But there's an opportunity for like a payoff and like an emotional release that hopefully our audience gets a sense of from watching the show, because I think that's one of the things that's really unique about this show is just there's like a lean into that emotional side of things. And it's like in the drum corps idiom, it's hard to get that across sometimes. You're speaking through 164 performers from a football field to an audience up in the stands. But there's also something very intimate and personal about this show this year. And I hope that as audiences around the country and around the world get to participate in that they feel that as well, and they get a chance to connect with it on that level.